When my wife, Melissa, came home one night with a strange look in her eyes, I knew something was wrong. She was distant, almost smug, and when I pressed her, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I deserved a night to feel free, Jason. I've been tied down with a baby while you chase your dreams, so I did what I wanted. I went out and lived a little." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. As the days passed, I pieced together what she meant. She'd been with other men, strangers she met at a bar. My heart broke, but she wasn't going to get away with shattering our family so easily. If she thought she could hurt me, I was going to teach her what real heartbreak felt like. She'd taken everything for granted, and I was done being her safety net. Melissa and I had been together for 8 years. We married young, fresh out of college, with stars in our eyes and big dreams. We were each other's everything, and for a long time, that felt like enough. We bought our first home, a small place in the suburbs, with plans to raise a family. But when our son, Caleb, arrived, life shifted. The daily routine, late nights, endless diaper changes, it was a lot, but I believed we were in it together, or so I thought. That night, everything changed. It was a Thursday, and I was in the nursery, trying to get Caleb to sleep. Melissa had gone out to blow off steam with some friends. She hadn't done this before. Usually, she was more than happy to spend our limited free time together, especially with Caleb being so young. When she walked in the door at 2 a.m., her face flushed, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. I knew something was off. "Have a good time?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, Jason," she sighed, shrugging out of her coat and dropping her bag on the floor. "I had such a good time. For once, I actually feel like I got a break." Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. She sounded too pleased, too triumphant. Her eyes met mine, challenging me, as if she was daring me to ask. "What kind of break?" I probed gently. She rolled her eyes, almost as if she were annoyed that I hadn't instantly caught on. Then she looked straight at me, her expression hardening. "The kind of break a person needs, Jason. I've been raising a baby and holding this household together while you're out there chasing dreams." I tried to understand, tried to see where she was coming from. I had been taking on longer hours at work, trying to secure a promotion that would set us up comfortably. But Melissa, she had always supported that. She said she wanted me to succeed, that she wanted a stable life for Caleb. So this sudden resentment, it was like talking to a stranger. "Are you saying I haven't been here for you? Because I thought we were in this together," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. Her laugh was cold, bitter. "Oh, Jason, you really don't get it, do you? You're off playing hero while I'm the one stuck here, day in, day out. And tonight, I deserved a night of freedom." The words were vague, but the look in her eyes was not. It was all the confirmation I needed, though my mind struggled to process it. I asked, almost in a whisper, "What did you do, Melissa?" The smile fell from her face. "What I wanted to do. I went to a bar, met some people, talked, danced, did what I wanted." I felt my hands start to shake. She wasn't admitting to it outright, but her words left little room for doubt. She'd gone out and crossed a line that we had both sworn to never cross. "So you think you deserve to betray your own husband?" I asked, the disbelief and hurt leaking through every word. Her eyes flashed, and she straightened her spine, almost defiant. "I'm not going to feel guilty about it, Jason. I deserve to feel alive. To feel something other than just exhausted." It was as if she thought that this was her right, her reward for enduring motherhood. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. After all we'd been through, all the times we'd supported each other, all the promises we made, she threw it away as if it meant nothing. And for what? A fleeting thrill? For a while, I just sat there, staring at her, my mind a blur. Then, without another word, I went to bed, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. I couldn't bear to look at her. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt the hurt turn to anger, and then something else, a cold, calculating resolve. She thought she could get away with this, that I would forgive her, patch things up for Caleb's sake, that I'd let her waltz back into my life with no consequences, but she was wrong. If she thought I would be the doting husband, the one to brush off betrayal and pretend that everything was okay for the sake of the family, she was about to be very, very surprised. The days that followed were tense, filled with a quiet, simmering anger. Melissa barely acknowledged what she'd done. It was as if she believed it would all blow over, like it was just a phase she was going through. She tried to act normal, making breakfast, going about her day, even smiling when she kissed Caleb's head. It was surreal, watching her act as though nothing had changed, as though she hadn't torn my heart out and stomped on it. Then one afternoon, as I sat alone in my car after work, the plan started to form. It was simple, but I knew it would hit her harder than anything she could have imagined. The first step was to change the bank accounts. She'd been relying on me to pay for everything: the house, bills, food, everything. She worked part-time, but it was never enough to support the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. I knew the strain would begin the moment she realized the funds weren't flowing freely anymore. I didn't cut her off completely. I wanted her to feel just enough discomfort, enough to realize that I wasn't her backup plan. After that, I started coming home late. I took on extra hours at work, stayed out longer. When I did come home, I was cold, distant. I gave her no explanation, no excuses. She'd lost the right to know where I was or what I was doing. Let her wonder. Let her stew. By the second week, she was starting to crack. One night, after Caleb was asleep, she confronted me in the living room, her voice trembling. "Jason, you're barely here anymore. I know you're angry, but don't you think it's time we try to work through this?" I just looked at her, my expression hard and unreadable. "Work through what, Melissa? You made it pretty clear how you feel about us." She flinched at that, but I felt no sympathy. I wasn't done. "I trusted you, Melissa. I loved you, and this is how you repay me? With some selfish justification about deserving a night out? We're not in the same place we were before, and frankly, I don't know if we ever will be." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She'd thought I'd come around eventually, that I'd forgive her, but now, she was beginning to understand just how deeply she had underestimated me. But that was only the beginning. I began making plans to file for custody of Caleb. She thought I'd stick around for him, that I'd tolerate her betrayal for the sake of keeping our family intact. But I knew that I could be a better parent to him on my own than in a broken home where love was nothing more than a shattered memory. I hadn't anticipated the extent of her shock when I told her I was considering divorce. The words seemed to freeze her in place, her face going pale as the realization sank in. "You can't be serious, Jason," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have a son. You don't want to break up our family." "You did that all on your own," I replied coldly. "I'm just making it official." As the days wore on, I began gathering evidence, things I could use if this went to court. Conversations, texts she'd sent in the past, records of our joint accounts, all of it was now carefully documented. I wanted a solid case, something that would show just how far she'd taken things. The tipping point came 2 weeks later when I discovered an email she'd left open on her laptop, a message to a friend about her night out, where she'd been and with whom. She described it as liberating and a reward for the sacrifices she had made. The audacity made me feel physically ill, but I saved a copy of the email anyway. One night, after she had a few glasses of wine, she let her guard down. She started talking, hinting at how freeing it was to let loose, to be her own person for a night. But when I didn't respond, didn't react, her smugness faded, replaced by uncertainty. I knew she was starting to realize just how much she'd underestimated the consequences of her actions, but that realization was too late. She had dug her grave, and all I was doing was helping her lie in it. By the time Melissa fully understood the extent of my anger, it was too late for her to claw her way back. My patience had run out, and any love I once felt for her was buried under a mountain of betrayal. She'd assumed I would be the same man I'd always been, the loyal, forgiving husband. But the husband she'd once known was gone, replaced by someone determined to make her feel the weight of her actions. I didn't start with a confrontation. No, that would have been too easy, too merciful. Instead, I let her unravel under the pressure of my silence and absence. The chill between us grew colder with each passing day. Every time she tried to engage me in a conversation, I gave her curt, one-word replies. I watched as the uncertainty in her eyes grew into full-blown anxiety. One morning, as I was about to leave for work, she blocked my way at the door, her expression desperate. "Jason, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "About what?" I asked flatly. "About us. About everything." She seemed to gather her thoughts, folding her arms protectively over her chest. "I know I hurt you, and I know things have been difficult since that night, but you can't just keep shutting me out." My gaze met hers, unblinking. "And why not, Melissa? Isn't this what you wanted? You needed your freedom, right? Well, congratulations. You got it." Her shoulders sagged as she realized I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I made a mistake, Jason. But we've been together for years, that has to mean something. Can't we try to rebuild things?" "Rebuild things?" I laughed, a sound so devoid of humor that it made her flinch. "You destroyed any foundation we had the moment you decided that freedom was worth more than your family. Now, I'm just making sure you feel the same pain you dealt me." She took a step back, her face etched with a mixture of shock and fear. I could tell she was beginning to understand that I wasn't bluffing. She hadn't expected me to react this way. I was the stable one, The dependable husband who wouldn't dream of shaking up our lives. But she'd never seen this side of me, determined, ruthless, and unwilling to forgive. As the weeks dragged on, I watched her carefully. Every missed call from me, every late night, every hint of secrecy, each one chipped away at her facade of control. She started calling me more frequently at work, asking where I was and when I'd be home. I could feel her desperation growing, but I offered no comfort. Then came the day when she brought up our bank accounts. I'd reduced her access to the funds gradually, enough for her to notice but not enough to confront me directly. Finally, one night, as we were both getting ready for bed, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Jason, I noticed the bank accounts. The money isn't going through like it used to," she began cautiously, her eyes searching my face. "Is everything okay with work?" "Work's fine," I said simply, brushing past her question. "But the accounts," she pressed. "You haven't been transferring funds as you usually do. Caleb needs things, Jason, and we're short on money. Why haven't you?" I cut her off, my voice cold. "Why don't you use some of that freedom you claimed you deserved and figure it out, Melissa? Since you're so capable of making decisions without consulting me." Her face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I felt a twinge of satisfaction. She was starting to feel it, the strain, the insecurity, the isolation. But unlike me, she didn't have the strength to endure it alone. And unlike her, I had no sympathy left to give. The final straw came when I took Caleb to visit my parents for a long weekend. I hadn't told her where we were going. I simply packed a bag, left a note saying we'd be back in a few days, and took Caleb to my parents' house across state lines. Melissa called me dozens of times, each call going straight to voicemail. I ignored them all, only replying once with a single text, "We're fine. Don't wait up." That weekend, my parents noticed something was off. My father pulled me aside while Caleb was playing with my mom in the backyard. "What's going on, son?" he asked, his gaze penetrating. "Is everything okay between you and Melissa?" I hesitated, considering whether or not to tell him the full truth. In the end, I decided there was no point in hiding it. They deserved to know, especially since this could affect their relationship with their grandson. "Dad, Melissa betrayed me," I said, the words bitter on my tongue. "She went out one night and did things I can't forgive." My father's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the weight of my confession. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Son, I'm so sorry. But what are you going to do about it?" "I'm not letting her get away with it, that's for sure," I replied, my voice resolute. "She thinks she can waltz back into my life like nothing happened, that I'll just forgive and forget for Caleb's sake. But she's about to find out that actions have consequences." My father nodded, his respect for my decision evident. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to steer me one way or another. He simply let me be, giving me the space to make my own choices. When I returned home with Caleb, Melissa was waiting in the living room, her face a mixture of anger and relief. "Jason, where have you been? Do you have any idea how worried I've been?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I set Caleb down, allowing him to go to his room. Only once he was out of earshot did I respond, my voice low and icy. "I told you we were fine. I'm not obligated to tell you anything anymore, Melissa. You gave up that privilege." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, repulsed by her touch. "Jason, please, I'm sorry. I don't know how we got here." "We got here because of your choices," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on her. "You decided our family wasn't enough. Now you get to live with that." In the weeks that followed, I moved to the next phase of my plan. I reached out to a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings, something I hadn't told Melissa about yet. But the final piece of my revenge was something far more personal. I decided to make her experience the betrayal she had inflicted on me, but worse. Melissa had always felt secure in our social circle, with our mutual friends and family acquaintances. She thrived on their admiration, the way everyone thought of us as the perfect couple. So, I started planting subtle hints, slipping details into conversations with friends and family that would cast doubt on her character. I made sure everyone knew I was the doting husband, the supportive father, while leaving them to wonder why Melissa was behaving so erratically. At social gatherings, I would casually mention how challenging things had been at home, or how Melissa had been struggling with the demands of marriage and motherhood. Nothing overt, but just enough to let people fill in the blanks themselves. Soon enough, whispers started, and her friends began to notice her strained behavior. They'd ask her if everything was okay, if she was happy. She was losing her grip on the perfect image she'd crafted, and I could see the cracks starting to show. Then came the night I took it a step further. We were at a neighborhood gathering, surrounded by friends. Someone mentioned their recent trip to Europe, and Melissa, unable to resist, Began talking about how she missed her days of freedom and adventure. The look on her face was almost nostalgic, as if she longed for the life she'd chosen to throw away. "That's funny, Melissa," I said, my tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "I thought you'd had enough freedom recently." She went silent, her cheeks flushing as everyone turned to look at her. She stammered, trying to laugh it off, but the damage was done. Our friends exchanged glances, some of them raising eyebrows, others whispering to each other. The whispers had begun to grow louder, and I knew that word would spread like wildfire. When we got home that night, she exploded. "How dare you humiliate me like that in front of everyone?" she shouted, her face flushed with anger. I merely shrugged. "I just told the truth. You seem to like your freedom so much, I thought you'd appreciate me reminding you." Tears of frustration filled her eyes, and she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. For the first time, I felt a sense of victory, a satisfaction that she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. By the end of that month, I had put the final piece of my plan into action. I served her with divorce papers. Her face when she opened the envelope was a mix of shock and devastation, as if she'd never believed I'd go through with it. "Jason, please," she whispered, clutching the papers as if they were a lifeline. "You can't do this. I know I messed up, but can't we work it out? For Caleb?" "You should have thought about that before you threw away everything we built," I replied coldly. "Now, you'll be facing the fallout alone." As she fell to her knees, sobbing, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of her betrayal lift off my shoulders. I knew the journey ahead would be difficult, especially for Caleb, but I also knew that I'd finally reclaimed my dignity, my peace, and my future. And as far as I was concerned, Melissa would have to live with the wreckage of her own choices. After filing for divorce, I thought my path forward was clear. I'd worked carefully to make sure every detail was in place: the financial arrangements, the custody plan, even the documentation of Melissa's betrayal. I'd done my best to protect Caleb, to keep him away from the ugliness between his mother and me. I thought I'd moved past the hurt, that I could start to rebuild a new life for myself and my son. But there was one final twist, one that would change everything. About 2 weeks after the papers were served, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer. She sounded tense, which wasn't like her. "Jason, we need to discuss something regarding the divorce proceedings. Melissa's filed a counterclaim. She's contesting the custody arrangement." My grip tightened on the phone as I tried to keep my voice steady. "On what grounds?" There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "She claims that you're emotionally unstable, that you've been manipulating her and trying to turn Caleb against her. She's also bringing up the times you took him out without telling her, particularly the weekend with your parents." I nearly laughed at the irony. All I'd done was keep Caleb out of the line of fire, away from her games and lies. But somehow, Melissa had twisted my actions into something insidious. She was playing dirty, trying to cast me as the villain. "Can she prove any of that?" I asked, my voice sharp with frustration. My lawyer hesitated. "In cases like this, it's not about proof, it's about perception. If she has a few friends to back up her story, it could be enough to sway a judge, especially if she claims you've been emotionally distant and retaliatory. It's something we'll have to counter, Jason, but it means you may need to provide evidence of your own." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd thought the divorce would be clean-cut, straightforward, but Melissa was turning it into a war, one where Caleb's well-being was now at stake. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at old photos on my phone, pictures of happier times when Melissa and I had believed in our future. There was one of Caleb on his first birthday, his face smeared with cake, Melissa laughing beside him. Looking at that photo now, it felt like staring at strangers. How could we have ended up here, with her trying to rip Caleb away as a final act of revenge? But as I sat there, something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to let her win, not after everything she'd done. She wanted a war? She'd get one. The next day, I met with my lawyer and went over every detail, every interaction I'd had with Melissa since that fateful night. I laid out all the evidence I had gathered, the emails, the documented changes in our bank accounts, and the testimonies from friends who had witnessed her strange behavior. I even brought up her sudden need for freedom, the way she had prioritized her own desires over the family. "We'll need character witnesses," my lawyer advised. "Someone who can vouch for you as a father, as a stable presence in Caleb's life." I knew exactly who to call. At the custody hearing, my parents sat beside me, their faces set with quiet resolve. They'd seen what Melissa's betrayal had done to me, how it had nearly torn me apart. They knew I was fighting not just for myself, but for Caleb's future. Melissa sat on the other side of the courtroom, looking composed, almost serene. She was playing the part of the wronged wife, the concerned mother fighting for her child. But her act was just that, an act, and I was ready to tear it down. One by one, my witnesses took the stand. My parents spoke about how I'd brought Caleb to stay with them during difficult times, how I'd always been present, always attentive. Close friends described how I'd stepped up as a father, how Caleb was the center of my world. They painted a picture of a man who was steady, reliable, and committed. When Melissa's turn came, she tried to spin her story, weaving tales of neglect, claiming that my anger and silence had left her feeling isolated and afraid. She described me as a stranger, someone cold and distant. She even shed a few tears, casting herself as a victim of my so-called emotional manipulation. But when it came time for cross-examination, my lawyer didn't hold back. "Melissa," she began, her tone calm but firm, "you claim that my client was emotionally unstable and that his actions made you feel afraid. Yet, can you explain why, despite your alleged fear, you went out that night and pursued other men while your son was at home?" Melissa stammered, her facade beginning to crack. I needed a break. I was overwhelmed. Jason was never around, and I felt like I was raising Caleb alone. Yet you made no attempt to discuss these feelings with him. Instead, you chose to break your marital vows and then blamed him for your actions. Is that correct? Melissa looked down, unable to meet the lawyer's gaze. Her silence spoke volumes. "And Melissa," my lawyer continued, "would you say that spending family funds on nights out with strangers is an example of putting Caleb's needs first?" Melissa's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find an answer. She glanced around the courtroom, realizing that her story was unraveling before everyone's eyes. She had lost control of the narrative, and there was no coming back. The judge ruled in my favor. I was awarded primary custody of Caleb, with Melissa granted visitation rights. As we left the courtroom, I felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that I'd fought for my son and won. My parents hugged me, their pride and support overwhelming. I'd done what I needed to do, for Caleb's sake. But Melissa didn't take the loss quietly. That evening, she called me, her voice laced with venom. "You may have won custody, Jason, but this isn't over," she hissed. "I'll make sure Caleb knows what you've done. I'll make sure he knows exactly the kind of man his father is." I took a deep breath, refusing to rise to her bait. "Melissa, the only thing Caleb will know is that his father did everything to protect him. The rest? That's on you." She hung up, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for myself, but for the person Melissa had once been. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone bitter, vengeful, and willing to sacrifice anything, even her son's happiness, to get what she wanted. The months that followed were filled with adjustments. Caleb and I settled into a new rhythm, creating a life just the two of us. I poured everything I had into being the best father I could be, making up for the time we'd lost during those dark days. My parents were a steady presence, their love and support helping me find my footing as a single dad. Melissa's visits were sporadic at best. She was polite, almost distant, when she saw Caleb, but there was a haunted look in her eyes, as though she realized too late what she'd lost. Her life had taken a different path, one that didn't include the stability or family she once took for granted. She was living with the consequences of her choices, and the toll was written all over her face. One night, as I was tucking Caleb into bed, he looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Dad, will Mom ever come live with us again?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Your mom loves you, Caleb. But sometimes, people make choices that take them down different paths. Right now, she has her own place, and we have ours, but you'll always have both of us in your life, even if it's a little different now." He seemed to accept that, snuggling deeper into his blankets. "I like it here, Dad. I like it when it's just us." Hearing that felt like a balm to my heart. Despite everything, Caleb was happy. He was thriving, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Months later, I got a message from Melissa. She wanted to meet, to talk things over. Against my better judgment, I agreed, meeting her at a small coffee shop in town. She looked worn, her confidence dulled, her eyes weary. "Jason," she began, her voice soft, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, for everything. I was selfish, and I took everything we had for granted. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." I nodded, acknowledging her words, but not allowing myself to soften. "It's a bit late for apologies, Melissa. You hurt me. You hurt Caleb. And for what? A moment of freedom?" She lowered her gaze, shame coloring her cheeks. "I know. I've paid for it in ways you'll never understand. But I wanted to say it. I wanted you to know that I regret it." I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of anger and pity. "Melissa, the life we had is over. We've both made our choices. Now, all we can do is focus on Caleb and give him the best future possible." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. That part of my life was gone, and so was the love I'd once felt for her. She would have to carry her regrets alone. As I left the coffee shop, I felt lighter, as though a weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The past was behind me, and a new future awaited, a future filled with hope, healing, and the joy of raising my son. In the end, Melissa's betrayal had broken something within me, but it had also set me free. And as I drove home to Caleb, I knew that I was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next.